Welcome back to another episode of Customer Discovery Cast. This is Ethan Halfwide, your host. This episode is brought to you by CustomerDiscovery.co. I'm here with Andrew Allemann, the founder of PodcastGuests.com, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about, how to take an idea and turn it into reality. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ethan.
Yeah. So, for the guests that are out there, this is exciting because I've actually, we just talked about this. I've been a member on your platform for a while. I had a podcast a long time ago, and now finally I've been back on it. I'm like, this is kind of a gold mine. Tell a little bit, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I've been in niche media, if you will, for the past 10 or 15 years. I have an online trade publication for the domain name industry, as well as a podcast around domain names as well. And then I created podcastguests.com about 4 years ago now, maybe close to 5, to solve a problem I was having with my own podcast. But then it turned into what was kind of a solution to me and into a business that has become a pretty big part of what I do and what my identity is.
That's awesome. Yeah. And what got you to that? Like, what was the day? What were you doing before you got to this point? Let's talk about that.
So I started I started Domain Name Wire, my trade publication, back in 2005. So it's been a really long time, coming up on 16 years now. And it's something that I've done along with some other business ideas along the way. And I started my Domain Name Wire podcast let's see, I'm up to episode 321. So we're talking about 6 years ago now.
Wow.
And yeah, it's and a lot of people say, wait, you write about domain names, you podcast about domain names, and it is a niche, right? It is something that a lot of people don't think about every day, but then there are a small number of people in the thousands that do think about it every day, and it's all they think about every day. And I started the podcast for it, like I said, about 6 years ago now. It's a weekly. So about a year in, though, I discovered that I kind of tapped my Rolodex as far as having guests on. Similar format to what we're doing here. I have a guest on and interview them. And I was out of unique guests, right? I mean, I was kind of cycling back through my list, and I said, well, how can I find some new and interesting people to be on my podcast? And I looked out there to see if there were any services that would help, any platforms. And I found that really the model was the agency model, right? These companies that will say, hey, we'll find 3 or 4 podcast guests for you this month, but it's $1,000, $2,000, that sort of thing. And so I wanted to find something that was free or very low
Wait,
cost.
a
Couldn't
thousand
do it
dollars per guest?
per month.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, right. To find 3 or 4 guests. And I'd say that's pretty much the starting point now. It can go up from there.
Wow.
And yeah, but it's not really cost effective for most podcasters. And so that's why I was like, well, let me create a platform that will do this so that people don't have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars a month. They can do it for free or a small amount to both find guests for their podcast as well as get booked as a guest on other shows. So that's kind of the origin of podcastguests.com, or what propelled me to create the solution.
Building a two-sided marketplace, which is kind of what Podcast Guests is. There's some overlap between podcast guests and hosts because oftentimes they, also have a podcast. But what has been the hardest part of starting a marketplace, and how did you start with that?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Marketplaces are very tough to create. And I think a lot of people see marketplaces and how they work and how efficient they are, and they're like, oh, I want to do that, right? I mean, I've got the buyers and the sellers or the guests in the podcast, but there is overlap here, and that's what helps. So when I started it, what I did was I reached out solely to podcasters, and I said, hey, I'm creating this service because I have the same issue that you have, and if you think this is an issue, if this is something you're interested in, let me know and I'll put you on this list. And so guests like to be guests, podcasters like to be guests on other shows. And so it kind of worked out that way, where we started just as podcasters that wanted to be guests on other shows, but then we were able to expand to people that just wanted to be on shows and didn't have their own podcast. So at the beginning, I put in a lot of elbow grease. I just emailed a lot of podcasters. I did it in individual emails that I sent to them because I don't like, I mean, I know we all get annoyed by these 3-step automated emails that we receive and the follow-ups and that sort of thing. So I just reached out individually to them, said, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I'm trying to do. And then are you interested? Do you want to join? There's no cost, that sort of thing. And after I got about 100, maybe it was closer to 200 people signed up, I sent out my first newsletter of opportunities of podcasts. And the response was fantastic. I mean, for only having 200 people on the list, people were getting 5, 10 responses, pitches on, hey, yes, I'd like to be on your podcast. And so that's when I knew I was really on to something.
Awesome. Yeah. And when did you start this again? What year?
I think it was 2016. So about 4.5 years.
About 4.5 years. So, like within that first year, I'm just curious in kind of your yearly growth because I'm sure it was really slow. Because, like you said, elbow grease started now, and you're building up those first 100 users. How did that? Because it looks like there's a ton of users right now. How did that change year after year?
Yeah, they're over 28,000 now. And
Wow.
so it's an interesting question. I've been asked that before, and there's no easy way for me to actually go back and
Oh,
see,
true.
uh, how many people were on at any given point in time. But yeah, you do have somewhat of a hockey stick, but not quite, right? It's
Right.
not, um, it's not like last year was a pretty extreme growth year, but it's definitely been increasing over time because every user can refer new users, right? And so that's where a lot of the growth comes from. It's kind of this organic word of mouth. And at first, it was very simple. It was just this email based service, which primarily now it is too. It's driven by email, right? I send out these lists of podcasts that are looking for guests. But I added the directory probably 3 years ago. I was looking for a way to monetize it. My background is kind of monetizing content with ads. And so that was my original thought. And I did have some advertisers in the newsletter. But then I talked to some people that said, hey, I like what you're doing, but as an expert, as a guest, I'd like to get booked on more podcasts and I want it to be easier. And I don't want to pay for the agency model where I get booked on several podcasts a month, but I'm paying $1,000+ What can you do that would make it so that podcasters can come to me? And so based on that feedback, I decided to create kind of this directory concept where, in addition to as a podcaster, you get my emails, you see these lists of podcasts you can submit yourself to, pitch to. Now you can create a profile on a site. You can create your own one sheet, and podcasters can come to you and invite you on their show.
Wow. Yeah. And that was actually, a question I was going to ask, but this is a good segue into it. This is the era of the individual creator, right? More and more
Mm.
people are starting their own media brands, whether it's through social media and podcasts. And I'm seeing more and more pop up, and I didn't want to miss the wave. So that's why I started mine. I love that mug, by the way.
Mhm.
A little product
Oh,
placement.
thank you.
Yeah.
My
Podcast guest.
Oh,
Yeah.
I went backwards there. Let's there we go.
Nice. Sign up now. Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, that's actually what I was gonna get into. Like for someone who's looking to start a podcast, right? You don't have to
Mhm.
go through like the process of starting it out because it actually is, it seems very confusing. But if someone were to start a podcast and look to monetize it, what would be your best advice for that?
Yeah, so I guess my best advice is to not copy what everyone else is doing. I see a lot of podcasters that come in and are like, "Oh, I'm going to be Joe Rogan or I'm going to be Pat Flynn and I'm going to have this massive audience. I'm going to be at the top of the charts and I'm going to sell ads or something along those lines." I recommend people coming into it with a different idea of monetization. And so if you run a business like you do, this might be an opportunity to meet new and interesting people that could become clients, right? And so a lot of times, if you were to just call one of these people up that you've had as a guest on your show and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you for 30 minutes and learn more about what you do, they're probably gonna be like, no, no, thanks. But if you say, hey, I'd like to introduce you to my podcast audience and have you on my show so you can talk about your expertise, then that becomes interesting to them, right?
Absolutely.
Another thing I do is look at it as, you have these new, interesting, great guests that people can learn from on your show. And then on the back end, though, people get to know you as the host and your product. Like at the beginning, you mentioned it was brought to you by and mention your company and that sort of thing. So I think that's how I would look at value for most podcasters.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely agree because there's a ton of copy and paste podcasts out there,
Oh yeah.
and when you're trying to create your personal brand, you really have to capture your own essence. Like that's what people are ultimately attracted to, right? Like what makes you you. Exactly, right? So when you're trying to copy someone else, it really diffuses that and kind of sheds light on that person you're copying. It doesn't. I feel like that's why a lot of people have trouble growing an audience because there is no true essence of who you are, that passion and that purpose. So that's also a little bit of a segue too. Like what why did you choose this way in general? What was that passion that led you along this way?
Yeah, I like, I know this is going to sound a little bit silly, but I do like helping people. And I like the what the internet does to create those opportunities to connect with people. I mean, I grew up, I was in high school in the 90s, high school and college in the 90s. And so the internet was kind of this new thing, right? I remember
Oh
getting
yeah.
on CompuServe with when I lived with my parents and through high school, getting on CompuServe is kind of this new thing. It wasn't really the web, if you will. And then going to college and having dial up my first year of college. But it was amazing how it kind of opened up this broader opportunity. And now we take for granted that we can have a Zoom call or you can Skype someone. You could talk to someone for free all the way across the world in India or Australia. And you can have these connections that we weren't able to have very easily before. And I get excited. That's what excites me about the internet is those connections, those personal connections. So I love hearing from people like, hey, you really helped me with this. And I just love that connectivity and any sort of platform that can help people that way. And I'm also a big believer in the power of podcasts to spread your message and your expertise, which is why it's personally gratifying to know that, I've helped facilitate thousands of discussions just like this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Who's your favorite podcaster? Will you say?
My favorite podcaster, I love comedy. I love stand-up comedy. And so my favorite podcast right now is this Mike Birbiglia podcast called Working It Out. And where he started it when COVID hit and they couldn't do shows anymore, right? And he would do these pretty big shows. He was on Broadway, actually, had a show on Broadway for a while, great special. But so he said, hey, why don't I bring you into the comedy process? I'll have some of my friend comedians on. And these are huge names, by the way, that he has on, and we'll
Bill
kind of
Burr?
walk.
Is that one of the
Uh,
names on there? That's my favorite
uh,
comedian right there.
I don't know if he's been on there or not. I'm a few episodes behind, but people like John Mulaney and ex SNL type people and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And so and they kind of talk about what jokes they're working on, right? And so you kind of get to go behind the process and learn a lot more about the comedians too and their backstories. So that's probably my favorite podcast right now.
Yeah, I would say Bill Burr's podcast right now, and then Bert Kreischer, if you've heard of him. He's kind of
Mm,
a newer
mhm.
guy as well, but he's really good friends. Bill Burr and Bert Kreischer actually have a joint podcast, but
Oh, cool.
it's really valuable for comedians because like how do you listen to comedians speak versus signing up for like a show? How do you and buying a ticket for a show? You get to listen to them on your morning commute to work.
Right.
Been awesome.
And it's
Yeah.
free.
And it's free.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's very beneficial for the podcast hosts as well. They have a much bigger audience. They grow that. And that's kind of my next question as well. We're getting into the finer nuances here, right? Because many people associate audience with community, right? And it's not. They're very independent. They commingle, but the difference between the audience, in my opinion, and I want to ask your expert opinion here. How do you? Here's the question: how do you convert your audience, which is people that are just aware of you, right? Just aware of ultimately my community right now is your audience because they're listening to you. But how have you done such a good job of converting an audience into an internal community that networks with each other and builds kind of their own brand? What's your best advice for that?
Well, I think one of the things is I make it super simple to join that community, and it's free too, right? So people just go to podcastguests.com, they enter their name and their email address, and then they're in, right? So I send them an email that says, "Great, this is how it works." So there's not You don't have to connect it to Facebook. You don't have to tell me your life story. It's very simple just to get started. And then the free the free part makes a difference, right? I mean, 98% of the people on my platform are using it for free, which is great. And they're an important part of the community. And then the ones that want to step it up a little bit can, of course, pay to get that extra exposure. But there's never a hard sell on that, right? It's I want people to kind of self-select for that. That are like, hey, I see this is beneficial to me to be a guest on podcasts, so maybe I should up my game here. And one way to do that, instead of paying thousands of dollars to an agency, is to pay $39 a month to podcastguests.com to help me get booked on more shows.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what are your kind of your big picture goals for this platform? Like you have a large user base. They're all in they're I don't know your conversion of daily active users or not, but from what I've seen in my experience on the platform, they're all very engaged. Like for
Hmm.
example, another guest that I connected with is, he's a AI expert. I think he was a professor for a while and taught about artificial intelligence. And I didn't really expect him to respond and be so eager to join, but he was, he's very receptive to it. So thank you for that connection as well, because I
Sure.
love talking about kind of the future of tech and the future
Hmm.
of these .com platforms that are kind of disrupting previously, difficult medium. How do you connect with these people? What are your plans for it? What do you hope to achieve, 5 years from now, or let's say by 2030, which is just crazy that we're talking about 2030
Boy,
as
yeah,
like the
we
end of
are,
it.
right? I mean, because
Yeah.
that's twice, having been around, let's just round to 5 years, right? That's a very long range view. And it's interesting because I have a publication that's 15, almost 16 years old. I can kind of think in those terms, right? And I don't know that that publication has changed much other than just growing, right? The audience growing over time. And I think, I could offer a million different services to podcasters. I mean, that would be the logical thing to do if you're just looking at this as a business. But I also want to make sure that I do the one thing I do very well, and that is connecting guests with shows for them to be on and vice versa. So I don't necessarily have a long roadmap. I'm working on some tweaks to make it easier and to connect people in new and different ways. But this isn't the sort of thing where I want to, you know, provide new tools to podcasters that unless they're asking for it, right? And that's one of the things I've tried to do be very careful with is wait for people to ask for something. And sometimes I'll prime the pump. I'll have some idea that I've heard from someone and I'll put it out in a survey. Hey, does this interest you? Um, but really it's using that customer feedback, if you will, that community feedback to develop it going forward.
Nice. Yeah, that's definitely good advice. And it, it's really interesting to see, like, at your current growth rate, if you're at 28,000 uses in 4 years, it, you'll I think it's safe to say that you'll be at over 100,000 users by 2030, like very conservatively speaking, probably
I
by
would hope so. Assuming
2020
podcasting
too.
stays on its trajectory, which I don't see any reason it wouldn't. I think so.
Yeah, it would be interesting for you to, look into seeing like if you could create, like, there's Buzzsprout and there's Anchor FM, and seeing if you could somehow create your own version of that as well and make it very seamless.
Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. Do you do the end to end kind of process? Like, should I help people with scheduling their podcast guests? But the thing is, there's 4 or 5, if not more, great scheduling tools out there already. And so my general feeling has been partner with these types of companies that are tangential, that are in the area, rather than compete. But there might be some opportunities, right? I mean, if you think about the when podcasters connect with each other and the opportunities around there, I think I can add some new features around that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, let's touch back on this, because, the core focus of my platform, my podcast as well, is to help people who are early in their journey. Maybe they're early to mid 20s. and you're still a young buck. What I mean is you've created something that's valuable, and that's kind of the end goal. People want to make money and they want to do things,
Right.
but oftentimes it's really just a focus on adding value to the community and adding value to, our network. How do we create something of value? What would be your best piece of advice for someone currently looking for ideas and currently looking for kind of the way to experiment and find things that, resonates with them?
Yeah, I would say the first thing to do is think about what your challenges are daily, whether in business or what your friends are telling them. I mean, if you listen to your friends who are in business, if you have an entrepreneurs group or something like that, you're going to hear over and over again the same problems that people are facing. You'll hear a lot of challenges with keeping good employees and developing employees and that sort of thing, right? Which is why there's so many businesses around that. But I think if you just keep your ears open and listen to what kind of issues they're having, and then say, well, what if I created a solution that helped with this? Would you be interested? And then kind of fleshing that out. And another thing you have to do, depending on your situation, if it's something that you're looking at as a potential for-profit type of opportunity for you, is to understand if people will pay for it. Right. There are a lot of people that will tell you that something sounds interesting, and then when you ask them to pay for it, they're like, no,
Yeah.
not interested. Right. So clearly it's not as big of a pain point as you thought. Right.
Right.
And so, and I talked to, the domain name industry is full of, I would say, kind of micro entrepreneurs and solopreneurs like myself that create businesses. And it's really interesting to talk to them and walk them through this iterative process when they're going through things. And I have a friend who's really good at it. He just asks all these little questions. And when I provide a little bit of feedback, he really digs into it. He's like, and I'm like, oh no, that's no big deal. And he goes, no, I want to understand your thought process there, even if you don't think it's a big deal, because that might lead to something that's interesting. Right. And so I think always being inquisitive like that and asking question after question, kind of using that Socratic method, why, and digging down those sort of rabbit holes. I
Root
think,
cause analysis. Yeah.
yeah, there. If we want to use a more business term than going the Socratic method, going down rabbit holes, which probably is a business term.
Yeah.
Um,
No, man, you're speaking my language. Like
yeah.
we spoke a little bit. That's why I started customerdiscovery.co because,
Hmm.
92% of early stage entrepreneurs fail, which is why we're having this conversation today. You're one of the ones that have succeeded, right? And 42%, I go to statista.org and I look at various, cited sources of data, but they say that 42% fail because there's no market need. And then
Yeah.
another 29%, these are the top two reasons, 92% fail because they run out of resources. The most common resource that they spend the most amount of money with or capital to is employment costs. But
Right.
nonetheless, the market need issue is where we focus, right? We help early stage founders with idea validation and then early user testing. So when you had an idea for podcast.com, you would probably want to interview people who would be excited for it, your first couple users, and then when you build the platform with that contractor you talked about, build the early MVP, you would want people to test it out. Is this
Right.
as valuable as you said it was? Does it solve your pain points? Is this something that you can pay money for? Like you said, that starts to get into customer validation.
Right.
So it's refreshing to see. I never like to walk people through that process immediately. I always like to see if someone who is successful cited that as a reason why they were successful, and it was
Hmm.
beautiful to watch you talk about that and touch on it because it's very interesting how we tend to stay away from rejection or harsh feedback, but
Yeah.
ultimately you
Yeah.
follow that path and that's how you get to where you are. That's how you get to 28,000 users. You have to incrementally fail and take small risks, or else you might have the biggest risk of all. You won't be able to create something worthwhile. So
Right.
thank you for
Right.
being one of the smart ones and the good ones.
Well, I mean, I had plenty of those failures along the way, right? And
That's
and
part of the
there,
process.
yeah, there's a lot of testing, and I'm one of those entrepreneurs that I've been involved with companies where we've raised money and have failed spectacularly
Let's
because
talk
of
about
that
that. Yeah.
that customer market and such. But um, I think that those lessons are fantastic, right? I mean, those are the types of that's where you learn, it's the school of hard knocks, but that's where you learn and you don't do it again. When I started podcastguests.com, I said, okay, how much am I realistically willing to invest in this to validate the model, to see if this is an opportunity? And at the time, again, my thinking was maybe I'll make some money from advertising from this, but that's a limited opportunity. But why don't I build this community and then see what comes from it? And I was like, well, if I put $5,000, $6,000 into this to get it off the ground, get through a few months of it and see if that's something that is interesting to people, and then I can scale it. Then I can put as much money as I want to into it as I scale it and as I monetize it.
Yeah, and you know, we're really getting into it here. This is kind of my favorite part, but with any successful entrepreneur, like you said, there's always the failures that help guide you to where you are today. And let's talk about that, man. What were the biggest failures that you ran into along the way? It could be from things before podcastguest.com or, you know, either along the way of creating that.
Yeah, I think so. So some things to think about there. So I left corporate America in 2004, I think, and 2004, 2005, around there, about the time I started my blog, but which was a hobby at the time. But for the few years after that, we raised money for a company that was doing technology commercialization. So we were going to large companies that had built technology internally, and then we would help them uh, find a partner to bring this to market, right? So the idea is, hey, this company had this internal problem that they solved. They couldn't find someone to do it for them, so they built something, which sounds beautiful, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but there were so many working pieces there, right? You had to get a technology, and I had done this at a Fortune 500 working for them, but now we were trying to do it for other companies. You had to First, you had to find a large company that had this internal project. Then you had to get them to say, yeah, we'd be interested in selling this or licensing it to a company that could bring it to market. Then you had to find that company to bring it to market. Then you had to work out this licensing agreement. And then, that licensing agreement, if you've ever done contracting that's at all complicated, you know how tough that is. And then you have to count on that intermediary actually having success with the product. And as a friend told me afterward, he said, there are easy ways to make money and there are hard ways to make money. And when you told me about your business idea, I thought that's a hard way to make money. And he was right. And we ran into obviously the Great Recession as well, made things
Mm,
challenging. But I did learn a lot of lessons in that. And that was one also where we did raise money. We hired people, but before we had fully validated our model, right? Because you're constantly validating your model. But
yeah.
so I would say that's one thing. On the podcastguest.com side, again, my initial idea was I can make money from advertising for this. And I can, right? I found that, it's extremely valuable to advertisers. But, how many ads are you going to put in each one? How is that going to scale? And it's not as exciting to me as helping podcasters. The way I ended up monetizing it, helping helping experts get booked more on more shows, excuse me, which helps everyone out, right? It helps the expert, it helps the podcaster. And so that model to me is nice. And it's also a subscription model, right? Which is the holy grail right now. Everyone wants a subscription. They don't want these one-off deals like what I was dealing with in technology commercialization. They want something that provides recurring revenue to them. And that helps you as a business owner too, knowing, okay, yes, my revenue might ebb and flow from month to month, but I've got this core base of subscribers that are there, and some will churn, but new ones will come in, and hopefully it continues to grow over time.
Yeah, yeah. And the first thing I'll say, because I do have a question too. The first thing I'll say is, yeah, the validation never stops, does it? Because
No,
really,
no.
you have to validate your core value proposition, and then your approach to solving, you know, your approach to delivering it, and then you have to validate the feature sets, and then validate the ways that you plan to improve each feature set, because you have to create version 3, 4, 3, 5 as you go on. to make sure that your platform is constantly improving based on customer feedback. So that's also a common misconception. Hey, I validated my business model. Let's go. Let's take this thing to the moon. I'm ready for
Right.
angel investment. We didn't get to the angel investment point until, we validated kind of the end-to-end process of helping a founder on the very early stage. And now consultancy side, like I said, what you said kind of scared me. I was like, oh God, licensing agreements. It's
Oh,
gonna keep me up at night,
oh,
But
yeah.
nonetheless, we'll always make it work. But my question to you, it's very straightforward. What would be your best advice to growing, 28,000 active users on the platform?
hmm hmm Well, I would say to figure out channels, grow channels that work for you. So you test them out, right? You test out all the online ad platforms, right? So Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Reddit, all these advertising models, and then see which ones work, see which ones, and it's amazing the difference between these models and which ones you can, I look at, okay, how much does it cost for me to get a new member? A new free member, right? I mean, that's kind of my onboard to get people on for free. A small percentage of them, 2, 3%, will decide to sign up for a paid account. So, for me, Facebook works particularly well for this. I have a lot of experience back in the day with Google AdWords. I just don't find it as effective anymore. And so, or certainly as cost effective. So Facebook helps with that. And then asking customers to help spread the word is something that a lot of people don't do, right? So
Mm,
organic growth is free. When word of mouth growth is free. And you actually putting that, in my emails to customers, hey, thanks for using this service. Keep in mind, most of them are using it for free. So if I say, hey, will you help me out? Will you lend me a hand? Do you mind posting about this on your social media account or forwarding this email to two friends that you think might be interested in it? That sort of approach, I think, is very effective to growing, kind of priming that pump as far as growing organically is concerned.
All right, Andrew, man, it's been great talking to you. Drop so many gems here for anyone who is either, currently in the idea phase looking to, go out and test and validate and just discover new ideas and new customers that could potentially use it. But, for now, guys, if you're in our audience and you want to start a podcast, which I highly recommend, everyone needs a podcast around your passions and the things you love speaking about. Go ahead and sign up for podcastguests.com. It can, just basically talk about what you want to start a podcast with and connect with other like-minded guests and hosts and go out there and kind of find yourself, start your own personal media site. Thank you so much for joining, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I look forward to staying in touch and watching the growth of podcastguests.com.